Well, there are two issues. One is that we have hugely increased numbers of people in prisons, and secondly that the actual prison infrastructure can't fit them in, so we actually have overcrowding. Okay, so the first point is that in relation to prison numbers, in Victoria we tended to have prison numbers around 3,500 for a number of years, and then in the last 3 or 4 years we've shot up to over 6,000, and we're looking at having another 1,000 by next year, so really significant increases in numbers. But the other problem then is that the prison infrastructure wasn't ready for that, so that prisoners are crowded into inappropriate conditions. They're in refurbished containers, double bunking and all that sort of thing. So there are two issues. One is the prison numbers, the other is the actual lack of accommodation. There are a couple of reasons. One is that more and more people are going to prison, and the reasons for that include increasing numbers of people not getting bail. So when they're charged but not yet convicted, they're being sent to prison rather than getting bail and living in the community. So that means that now nearly a quarter of the people in prison are there on remand. They haven't actually been convicted. So that's a really large component of the prison population. There's also more people going to prison because the current government has passed legislation requiring more people to go to prison rather than alternative sentences, and requiring longer and harsher sentences. So we've lost options such as suspended sentences and home detention, which gave judges more options in terms of sentencing people. So those are, I guess, a couple of the reasons why the numbers have increased coming into prison. And then at the other end, people are not coming out of prison as regularly or as soon because we've had significant changes in our parole system. So where previously most people would be released on parole a little bit before the end of their sentence for good behaviour, which was a really important incentive to good behaviour, and they then had the support of a parole officer in the community, helping them settle in, helping them to find accommodation, sort out what Mikey is, sort out how to do things online. People leaving prison after long sentences can really have a lot of problems settling back into the community. But what we've done now is to make it very difficult to get parole at all. So people are then staying in prison longer and being released at the end of their sentence with no supports. Not really. You would think so, and that's the way it's presented. But the reality is that the crime rates in Victoria are not increasing in all areas. Some crime rates have increased, some crime rates have gone down. But overall, Victoria's crime rate is still below the rate that it was 10 years ago. And actually, the research in Australia and the research internationally says that there's not a lot of connection between crime rates and prison rates. So in some countries, when crime goes up, prison rates go up. In some countries, the opposite happens. And in some countries, they go up and down without any connection at all. So the use of imprisonment is a political decision by a government that they want to punish using prisons rather than alternative forms of punishment. So it's clearly a policy decision, a political decision. Well, given that it's not really related to crime rates, given that it is a decision that's been made by governments, ideally governments would use their power to say we're no longer going to use prisons the same way. The recent Victorian election indicates that major parties have no particular interest in taking a less punitive approach to sentencing, unfortunately, and it is seen as a political vote winner. I don't know whether it actually is, but major political parties, both here and internationally, assume that people want to see governments that are quote unquote tough on crime. If a government decided it wanted to make a difference, it would be very easy to do. You would simply ensure that fewer people were held on remand, that more people got bail, which is readily done and properly supported. You change your sentencing practices to give judges more options. So you establish more alternative forms of of punishment that don't require the use of imprisonment. I mean, again, these are government choices that can be made and have been made internationally to good effect. And finally, of course, you reinstitute an effective parole system so that people can leave prison earlier with the support of their parole officer, rather than, as I've said, leaving at the end of their sentence with no supports, making it actually more likely that they'll reoffend because they can't settle back into the community safely. So those are at least three ways in which governments could make a big difference. Countries with a more robust human rights scheme than we have in Australia have certainly been able to address some issues to do with prison overcrowding. And prison overcrowding is a significant issue in many, many countries. Australia is not alone in this. They have been able to address that by looking at some of the conditions that arise when prisons are overcrowded. And in some cases, courts have said that they actually represent a violation of human rights. So violation of the right to humane treatment, violation of right to life in some situations where conditions are particularly grotesque. So that's one way in which human rights can, I guess, provide a measurement, a baseline at least, of saying what's acceptable conditions in prisons. We don't really have that sort of scheme available to us. The Victorian Charter could be used for that purpose, but hasn't particularly been used in that way to date, other than in perhaps a few individual cases. But the other way in which human rights can be really useful in this area is with monitoring. So the whole idea of having an external oversight body that can look at the implications for prisoners of systemic changes like overcrowding. So we have, for example, the Victorian Ombudsman that does have rights to look at human rights violations, does have powers to do that under the Victorian Ombudsman Act, and that office has been pretty proactive in looking at rights violations in Victorian prisons. So they've looked in recent years at health provision in prisons, they've looked at juvenile detention, they've looked at deaths in custody, and the Ombudsman's currently looking at issues to do with overcrowding and access to programs. So there are things that can be done, but across Australia it's not such a powerful sort of mechanism because we don't have those formal protections. If the Australian government were to ratify the optional protocol to the Convention Against Torture, OPCAT, which would introduce both domestic, local and international monitoring, I think we'd have some really powerful protections for people in prisons.